intermediate forms preserved in modern species. And notice he's not, he knows that the eye, complex eye that we have evolved from a progenitor of millions of years ago, but he sees evidence in other species of different kinds of eyes that makes it fairly respectable to imagine that they did evolve. He was very obsessed with the idea of instincts and behavior. And he thought that that was very difficult to explain. Remember, this is a man who didn't know about genetics. He didn't know about genes. So he was very concerned with explaining instincts and behavior in terms of natural selection. And then he was very concerned with the last step in speciation. That's the development of reproductive isolation, so that the two varieties can no longer interbreed and then now they become species. And he wonders, how could this have happened? And he discusses it, but he really doesn't get very far, but he counts it as a major objection to his theory. Now in the blogosphere in the last few days, there's been quite a discussion about how this relates, how modern scientists would approach this. And as it turns out, modern scientists are very reluctant to bring up objections to their theories these days. So we've evolved now to a situation where this actually seems unusual. It should be the norm in science, but nowadays people tend to, you can sort of imagine, right? You're writing a grant application, you're asking for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Say, oh, and by the way, here are the major objections that you should keep in mind as you're trying to decide whether to give me the money. They sort of gloss over that a little bit. So although we all recognize this is what you should do as a scientist, it's kind of a lost art, actually. It's one of the reasons why we respect Darwin so much. So, and one of the objections was instinct. He actually devotes a whole chapter to it. He says, how could you imagine this instinct where bees, build these combs and have this elaborate behavior? How could that possibly have evolved? He really doesn't come up with a very good answer. He also talks a whole chapter on hybridism, trying to understand that this is the development of reproductive isolation. He didn't talk about lions and tigers because he didn't know about this, but nowadays, you probably all thought that lions and tigers are separate species, right? Maybe you all know this. They interbreed quite readily in zoos. So that if a male tiger mates with a female lion, the offsprings are called tigons, and if a male lion mates with a female tiger, they're called ligers. Okay? So these are not species. These are actually varieties. They are isolated in the sense that in the wild they don't interbreed, but they're still capable of it. So technically they can't be called species. Well, so he devotes a whole chapter. He knows about, he doesn't know about lions and tigers, but he knows about various flowers and he knows about donkeys and mules and asses, and goes on and on about how and his answer is that, well, it's sort of what you would expect if species are evolving, right? There's going to be times when you can form hybrids. There's going to be times when the hybrids are sometimes sterile or they're sickly. That's exactly what you expect from a slow and gradual process where two varieties are on the path to becoming species. That's why the chapter is so important, because it explains or it justifies this gradual separation of two varieties so that eventually there are no more viable hybrids. A whole chapter on hybridism, an excellent chapter. He then has a chapter 9 on the imperfection of the fossil records, where he describes that you can't expect perfection in the fossil record because fossils are quite rare. He has a chapter on the geological succession of organic beings, and this is now standard procedure in all the evolution textbooks. One of the evidences for evolution is the fact that species in different localities can be very different. The species that live in Australia are very different than the species that live in North America. A lot of marsupials in this one. You think about, why should that be? If God created species, why would he go to all the trouble of creating a whole bunch of similar looking species here and a whole bunch of similar looking species here? But if they evolved in place, it shouldn't be very much of a surprise that all the ones that live in Australia are similar fundamentally, and all the ones that live in North America are different and similar fundamentally. This sort of geological argument for evolution and formation of species is actually a very potent argument. He's the first person to make that argument, to point out what's obvious, but you don't think about it, right? So people didn't think about how to explain that. Why is all the species he saw in Argentina are so very different than the species he saw in England? Okay, and you can't explain all that in terms of natural selection. A lot of it just has to do with the fact that certain kinds of species were present there and others evolved. That's sort of the geological succession of organic beings. So the chapter 11 then continues again with the same theme of geographical distribution, and it's so important that he has geographical distribution continued. He breaks it into two chapters, 11 and 12, and then he's nearing his conclusion now. He has the mutual affinities of organic beings in chapter 13. Essentially what he's saying is, look at how similar, look at all mammals are alike. And my Linnaeus developed this classification scheme where you group everything has certain characteristics becomes mammals, then you have primates and ungulates and various other carnivores, okay? And they all form a kind of a hierarchical grouping according to the Linnaean classification of animals. There's genus, then there's orders, and there's families. Okay? How does God explain that? Okay? What's the explanation? Why would God have, why would the Creator have done that? Okay? But if they evolved, this is precisely what you expect. This is exactly what you expect. All the mammals share a common ancestor. All the primates share a common ancestor. Of course, they're all going to have certain similarities. And of course, when we look at them, we're going to all classify them. These are all primates. Okay? Why? Because they all have a common ancestor. That's why they look alike. That's why the Linnaean classification scheme works the way it does. And again, it's one of those things where, Huxley goes, I wish I'd thought of that. Or how stupid of me not to have thought of that. It's the sort of thing that nobody just actually thought about or tried to explain. And yet here he's offering an explanation that's perfectly reasonable if life has evolved. Chapter 14 is his recapitulation, his conclusion. He sums everything up. His whole volume is one long argument. It may be convenient to have the reading to recapitulate. This is the famous phrase, one long argument. His whole book is one long argument in favor of the concept that life evolved and in favor of his explanation, namely that it's by natural selection. So he's combining those two things. It's not always clear. It's not like he says, this paragraph is about whether evolution happened, this paragraph is about that. They're mixed together, but the 2 points are very important. And then his famous, the last words in the chapter, there's grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, etc., where he closes with the idea that this may be distressing to you, but it's also wonderful to think that this is how life could have happened. It could have evolved. That's amazing. Okay? It's just as amazing as thinking that somebody might have created it. That wasn't the end of Darwin's writings. He published quite a few books afterwards, including a book on instinct, book on climbing plants, book Descent of Man. He didn't talk about human evolution in Origin of Species, but later on he addresses it. So there's lots more, but let's think now about what's happened post Darwin. What Darwin didn't know, or what